And you're very welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. Enda here in the company of James and Alan Morrison. And Celtic are now double winners at the end of the season. And I mean, if you said that at the start of the season, you would have bit your hand, whoever's hand off for it. And even after the drama of throughout the year and how bad it felt at times, to come away with a record that's pretty much the exact same as Ange Postecoglou's, I'd say Brendan Rodgers is pretty happy with that. But we will move on as well. There's going to be some new names coming into the team, and we are entering the transfer window. So there's loads to talk about on today's show. We're going to be doing the cup final first, and then we'll be looking a little bit ahead to next season as well as back at the season as a whole. Um, Alan, you were in Glasgow for the Scottish Cup, as was I.
So are you?
Um,
Are you
yeah,
not going to tell?
we'll
You're
get
not
to
going to
my
tell the
experience in a
listeners?
second. We'll get to my experience in a second.
It's far more
Um,
entertaining than anything I have to say.
how did you find Glasgow for the Scottish Cup final? And then I will get to my story.
Yeah, some bits were very nice, other bits less so. But yeah, and it was funny, So shout out firstly to Ray and Christy and Andy that kindly let me share their cup final day with them. So thank you guys. They were all really confident the Celtic were going to win like 3 or 4 nil, and as soon as I saw the teams, I wasn't confident at all like that. I just thought this is going to get really sticky. But actually, because I just assumed that when I saw the teams that Clement was going to line up with Raskin and Diamande and Sterling in midfield and play, Cantwell and whoever else they had as wide players, Silva. I just thought that's how he's going to set up, and this is going to be really sticky. We're going to they're going to really sort of make it the midfielder absolute slog, and we're going to struggle for fluidity. But he didn't do that. And in fact, I don't know why Clement played any midfielders at all, because he basically just kind of missed it out for most of the game. So lots of interesting nuances to it. We'll get into obviously the fact that it's such a hollow victory, isn't it? Because how dreadful were we, and how can you be such a poor team and be so second best that how dare we pick up that trophy? I mean, we'll need to get into that as well, I guess.
Yeah, well, like I've spoken about this already on the podcast this year in how badly Celtic have played against Rangers and
Mm.
still not lost to them. And like last Saturday was genuinely an impressive effort from Celtic as to how bad they could possibly play and still beat Rangers. It was it was dreadful. I don't like genuinely. I don't know if anybody can come away from that game and say with an honest, straight face that they were impressed with Celtic's performance, because it was really, really, really poor. But
But the other lot were
any
worse. That's the
but you
thing. They
see,
were
well, here's the
significantly
thing.
worse.
It's the same as there not being any. There's no such thing as a bad penalty that goes in. There's no such thing as a bad Scottish Cup final that you win. Nobody will remember in 10 years' time that Celtic played so badly in this final. They will remember that Celtic won and Adam Idah scored so late to win it for them. But much like hubris was the key theme on the podcast last week ahead of the game, hubris came back to bite me in the hole a little bit in Glasgow, as some fans that I met in the Brazen Head and the Gorbals before and during the game will know. So I got the tickets last minute. They were sorted by my boss, who had a few connections in Glasgow. Went to the stadium, was outside Hampden, outside the front where the split was happening between the two sides or two fans. Guy comes up, hands me the tickets, and I noticed that the number of the gate, or the letter of the gate that I have, is directly on the opposite side of where all the Celtic fans are going in. So we go into the stadium, me and my pal. We go into the stadium and we say, look, we're going to be in the Ranger section. As long as we're close enough to the middle, we should be okay. We go to our seats. It keeps getting further and further and further left of the middle of the ground and right into the corner, right beside the vast majority of let's say non-friendly Rangers fans.
The Cubs?
So yeah,
The
so
Cubs, yeah.
not quite the ones who were running away in the middle of Glasgow city centre at 10 a.m. after attacking a Celtic pub, but not where you want to be if you're a Celtic fan. So we did a risk assessment. We tried our best
Very good. Very
to
good.
get across to the other side. The stewards were not willing to let us go across. A policeman actually just told us we were fucked, and then we left the ground. So my Scottish Cup final, I can still say that I went. I can still say that I was at the Celtic Rangers game. I wasn't at it for very long. I ended up back in the Brazen Head, watching it in the pub like everyone else who didn't get a ticket. So yeah, it was. Look, it was fun. It was fun.
You know, how do you feel about your boss telling you that he hates you without telling you that he hates you?
Does your boss have key man life insurance on you or something?
Well, there's a guy who works for our UK team who is a Rangers fan, Ed Campbell. He works for Politics Joe, and he sent me a message today to say, "Oh, it's great to see there's another bear in the office." So yeah. They're having a right good laugh at me, as should everyone in the comments. And for anybody who says or is going to say in the comments that we shat it, we did. But I still have the ability to speak on this podcast as a result. So that was my Scottish Cup final day experience. I'm glad that Adam Idah pulled it out of the bag to save me from being completely miserable, to be honest. Because when that Rangers goal went in, I was like, oh my god, this day can't get any worse. I suppose it's hard to analyze this game, especially when you watched it in the Brazen Head like I did. But the biggest moment is that push really on Joe Hart. Like it's soft, right? I'm right in saying that it's soft.
I mean, I don't think so. I think
No?
it's. I think if he does that kind of movement and the arms aren't fully extended, then I would say yes. But the fact that Raskin completely extends his arms and almost locks out his elbows, I mean, that's a shove. I mean, it's not a violent shove, but it's, you know, if you extend your arms like that, you're begging to get called for a foul. So
Yeah.
I didn't think it was.
Sorry,
I didn't.
the Yorkshire
Go ahead.
Whistlers. I'll quote him directly. Right, so this is a neutral, you know, independent, fully qualified expert. His summary was an easy decision to chalk off the goal for a clear foul on the goalkeeper. That's it. That's it. That's all. That's really all you need to say in the end.
Yeah, I think that it was fortuitous, meaning that had he not fouled him, I think Hart may have struggled to deal with it. So, it was a good thing that Raskin was dumb enough to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And the only, and I don't know from a rules perspective, but from what I read and heard, any grappling that Taylor was doing pre-kick, I mean, it's not reviewable. It's not, you know what I mean? Like that's the kind of thing that the ref either deals with before the kick, as they often do, and come out and wag their fingers at them both and pretend that they're, giving them a talking. But as soon as the ball's kicked, if they've already kind of separated from any romantic interlude before the kick, then it's a kind of a done deal. So yeah, to me, that's that whole episode's kind of a classic. Understandable, I get it. Like all fans are like this. It's not unique to Ranger supporters of the art. We'll gripe over those type of things too. I mean, it's just to get the emotions of that kind of goal and then have it rightfully chopped off. It's easy to hallucinate alternate realities.
Yeah, that's true. Look, it's one of those ones. I do think it's a foul, but I would be annoyed.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just one of those
100%.
that like you can completely understand why people are annoyed by it. But
particularly because it may not have been impactful, meaning that it's not like, the ball was going dead to where he was standing, where Hart was standing. So he was going to have to make an athletic, quality play in order to deal with that cross. Well, corner. So yeah, I mean, I'd be pissed at Raskin if I was it was a numbskull, stupid thing to do. which that goes back to general. Like I think the reason why I can only speak for myself, but in talking to some other people and messaging and stuff, I think the reason why the performance felt so bad was a combination of expectations going into it. I mean, they were pretty high, as Alan was saying. A lot of people, including me, I thought we'd probably until I saw the lineup from Rangers, I felt really confident, assuming that they played Lundstrom. And the other part is that they were a wreck. I mean, they had a left back who had 1 day of training. Raskins barely played. They have 2 wingers playing that aren't wingers. They have their 3rd and 4th string center backs playing, and TikTok Todd running around and not doing anything of substance. So the fact that it was as kind of close as it was, given the expectations and given the mess that Rangers were, I mean, it was disappointing to me. I mean, it was like, we should have blown them away with that, with those dynamics and how in form and relatively fit we were going into it. But again, none of that matters. I mean, that's the microcosm of, kind of expectations and performance. We get to dance and enjoy from all the discussions that we had from January forward about who gives a shit about performances. It's all about getting over the line in the league, and this was like a cherry on top. So I think it. I think there are some projectable things out of the game that we can talk about as we go forward potentially, but yeah, as far as the microcosm of the game, that's kind of my take as to why it felt a bit deflating. Until the 90th minute. I mean,
yeah. I don't want to dwell.
That was real cool. Last thing I'll say, that cup final against Aberdeen with the legendary Rogic goal was pretty crap too.
Yeah,
and that hasn't really the legacy of that crapness hasn't really lived on. So yeah, I suspect this will be similar.
The only thing that'll be remembered from this game is Adam Idah's goal. Essentially, like that will be what is remembered from it, and that's why I don't want to dwell on it too much, because I mean, like we spoke about it last week on the podcast in terms of form in the derby, but also then how do you relate that to a cup final, because a cup final is almost a completely new thing that they don't tend to follow the same rules as any other game throughout the season. It's almost like a game that's plucked out of nowhere, and you can't really take too much into it, because I just remember like a couple of years ago when Liverpool and Tottenham were in the Champions League final. Both teams were in amazing form, and it ended up being one of the worst Champions League finals in the last decade because the two teams just shat it. And not that Celtic shat this Scottish Cup, but there was a lot of bad stuff in this, Alan. But at the same time, I don't think it's things that you need to dwell on overly, because let's face it, even the match day winner may not be at the club next year. So it's hard to take much from this other than Celtic have won the double, and it's another trophy for Brendan Rodgers. And the feeling, he said he would be back in May to chat to the fans. He was back at the stadium with 2 trophies in his hands. Promise fulfilled, essentially, for Brendan Rodgers.
Yeah. Listen, there's no way that, they weren't going to kick, fight, punch, scrap for their lives in this game. There's just no way that wasn't going to happen, right? And then also, Clement, it's obvious he doesn't have faith in a lot of the players in his squad. And so rather than risk trying to play football, which, if you watch them against some teams, when they beat Dundee 5-2, they pass the ball around pretty well. But against Celtic, he doesn't feel he's got the players to do that. And so he made the game, basically, he just tried to eliminate the midfield from the game. And their defence sat so deep, right? So they were not going to get caught in behind. They were not going to get caught on the break at all. And they had 5 players. It was basically like some kind of basket, I don't know what sport you'd call it, like a netball kind of formation. It was like a 5 and 5 was how they set up, with Raskin sitting in front of the defenders. I mean, I didn't even know Yilmaz was playing until very late on. He never went over the halfway line. They just sat deep, and they just made sure Celtic couldn't break. Celtic couldn't release their quicker players over the top. And then, of course, they just played long balls, and then it was all just, can we fight for it? Can we win second balls? Can we win corners, etc., etc.? And that was the game plan. And that's the game plan of a manager that doesn't trust his team to out football, the opposition. And fair enough, he's probably right. So I don't think it was. I don't think it was ridiculous what Clermont set out to do, but it certainly contributed to being a really bad game, football. And then I think, Celtic didn't. I think the frustrating thing for me is at half time, the guys I was with, because Celtic were already 3-0 up, were like, oh. And I was like, oh, this is all right. It seemed to me like it was just a matter of time. If we just keep going, we just be patient, we keep the ball, we keep pressing them, it'll come. I had no issue with that. But the frustrating thing for me is we seemed to get worse as the game went on. And they got more of a boost from their substitutes initially than we did. But we obviously, that paid off for Celtic in the last minute. But, but even then, even as bad as Celtic were in that second half in terms of, and by bad I mean really not creating many chances of note, to say that they were supposed to have dominated until the 89th minute and, they were supposed to have had a brilliant second half. They didn't have a shot on goal between the 55th and the 83rd minute. I don't mean a shot on target. I mean any shot at all at goal. Now, Celtic didn't have any either, to be fair. Well, we had one in the 56th minute. But what I'm saying is, both teams were dreadful at this point. Both teams were really struggling for any attacking sort of cohesion at all. So, listen, I'm not going to sit here and pretend it was a good Celtic performance. As James has said, it absolutely wasn't. But they mainly controlled the first half. They controlled the early part of the second half. And then I think whether it was just fatigue or what, or, it just kind of, both sides just became dreadful at that point. And really it was just a case of almost like who could get a free kick or a corner or something first that would, that would hit the target. So listen, I'm old enough to remember the 1980 when Andy Lynch penalty 1-0 Celtic, and the 1989 Joe Miller 1-0 Celtic, and they were both absolutely appalling games of football as well. And this is not to be not unexpected. They were, it was always going to be two teams fighting it out, and they made sure that Celtic just played us or tried to play like they normally do. They tried to make it this kind of long ball netball game, which is fair enough. There's no right or wrong way to play football, but it did tend to make it rather difficult to watch.
And in the end, it just came down to a moment of quality, and it's a very good jumping off point for moving on towards the future and what the future might hold for Brendan Rodgers at Celtic and some of the players at Celtic. And the winning goal was, not really set up, but it was assisted. He will get the assist for it by Bernardo. He made a bursting run and got a shot on target, and then it was finished by Adam Idah. I mean, this is the part of the podcast that people will start to hate us for, because I can almost guess how it's going to go, because the hype is in overdrive for Adam Idah to come back to the club after what he did. So
the Derby dust has been sprinkled in huge proportions.
Yeah, I'm going to lay the foundations, and then we're just going to see what we think. So, I mean, he came in 15 games, 8 goals in the Scottish League, winner in the Scottish Cup final. Also scored what could have been a winning goal at Rangers. Scored big goals when Celtic needed big goals. Scored a couple of winning goals outside of that as well. And did what he needed to do. Like he did what Celtic needed, was that player who could come in if Kyogo wasn't scoring. Adam Idah could come in and he could score goals, and it gave Celtic a different dimension. So he made me eat my words slightly. I think he overperformed from where I had seen him previously. I think he played to the potential of the player that we had mentioned in that Ireland game against Portugal. Like that's the Adam Idah level that he can get to, but whether he can do that over a consistent basis is where I probably had the most amount of questions over him. So take away the fairy dust of scoring the winning goal in the derby to win the Scottish Cup. Do Celtic spend the £6 million needed to bring Adam Idah back on a permanent basis?
Well, I'll first say that this was one of Alan's patented 3 mistakes lead to a goal situation. It's like a quintessential example of that because Scott Wright pulls an absolute, I don't even know what the hell he was doing, which enables the turnover. And then Raskin, who again has hardly played, is 90 minutes into a game and doesn't make a tackle he probably should have, or like a fresh player probably at least has a better shot at doing it, which, and Bernardo makes a great turn and, smokes him. But, he was gassing already Raskin pretty clearly prior to that. And then, the best goalkeeper in Scotland, in the world, in the history of the universe, dumps a ball right out front, and it's a swerve shot, but for Christ's sake, it's from 20 yards. It's, should have been handled by a professional keeper who's the greatest of all time. And so there's 3 mistakes. There's your goal. And, so yeah, I just wanted to say that first. But yeah, this is where, first of all, we got a small sample size, so this is a any kind of statistical analysis on Idah, I think, is fraught because of that. So that's where you need to look at his history, longer term, what kind of player he's been, what's the potential fit, what's his potential development curve, and there's a lot of subjectivity in doing that kind of an analysis and giving my opinion. The first thing is what we do know. This is kind of the measurable stuff. And this is just from the league minutes that he had, which was almost 8 games, so not quite Allen's magic 9 in the league, but he would have that with the cup games. Is probably he scored on average 0.76 non-penalty goals, but that was on 0.39 in post-shot xG. So what does that mean? Is that a number of his goals were scored because, like in the one derby, the best keeper in Scotland did not stop a shot that he pretty much shot right at Butland. And Butland wasn't quick enough to save it. So there's some of that, which is that, his actual play, his actual quality of performance is not reflected in the number of goals that he scored. And there's a chunk of that that's from opposition keeper play. And that, I always go back to these controllable versus uncontrollable. So I think that the mood on his performance level while he's been at Celtic, and again, with the caveat that it's not a sample size enough for it to be at all determinative about, what type of player he is or whether we should sign him, is way inflated. And then you throw, the Derby dust on top of that, and it's like completely out to lunch relative to where he's performed while at Celtic, in my view. I actually, I think, given his athleticism, given Rodgers' preferences, I think we could do worse in that price range. It wouldn't, I wouldn't be horribly critical about it, but I think we can do better in that price range. I think if we're smart, we can do better. And, so yeah, it wouldn't be my preference, but it also wouldn't like drive me nuts. It wouldn't be like it wouldn't be an Abelgard loan signing where I'm sitting here going, what the hell are we doing? Or a Quan signing, or, it wouldn't be of that level of just a patent absurdity. But yeah, that not my preference, but as we get to the second one, I'll have a stronger opinion. But Idah, I've been kind of wishy-washy on.
Yeah, so I think you actually touched on a key point there in saying that if we're smart, we could do better. And I think you're giving Celtic a lot of credit there. So what I mean by that is we actually have a bit of a proven person here that we know there's no risk in, whereas with Celtic's track record, especially in this price range, we do not have a good track record in being smart. So I actually think I've done probably a 180 on Idah, and not because of the last minute goal, more so of what I've seen elsewhere from his game. Like, you have to remember, he is also 23 years old, and I think this is probably the crossroads of his career. This is probably the moment where he either takes the risk and goes to Celtic and kicks on, or he remains at Norwich and still has 3 years remaining and still tries to make it at a low level Premier League side, which, doesn't tend to work out all that often. Um, but mentally, the difference in playing for Celtic and what that can do for a player's progression, I think this might be the move for Idah. This might be the move that is the one that is the catalyst for him to kick on and improve his career and improve as a player and improve what we've seen so far. Whereas he just has not done that at Norwich, because there's been so much turnover in manager, Championship to Premier League to Championship to on the bench to long-term contract, and his career's been all over the place. Whereas it's sort of like when semi-professional golf player finally gets his PGA card, and then suddenly he's a world beater because all of the pressure is off. Like, that's sort of where I almost feel Adam Idah could go here. And I think I've just seen enough from him in terms of his overall play as opposed to the goals, Alan, that would make me confident that if the expectations are lowered from Celtic fans in that he is going to be a Giakoumakis-esque number 2 that is there for pressure moments when you need to change your game plan and chime in with 12 goals a season to 12 to 15 goals a season. That's where Adam Idah is. If that's what we're getting for 6 million, that's probably where Celtic fans need to change their mentality towards him.
Yeah, so I've enjoyed watching him. I really have, from a sort of fan perspective. But when we talk about being smart, if I said to you, you could have exactly this profile of player, 23-year-old striker who's got completely different characteristics to Kyogo, and I can get you him for about £2 million rather than 6 million. You'd think, oh, that's quite smart. And the funny thing is, such a player exists in the building, right? So this is going to infuriate, I know, but I can't help the data, right? So, just to say, completely agree with James, right? There isn't enough data. I don't have 900 minutes for even with cup games, for Idah, even with cup games. So this is all quite, carries lots of warnings, really. But essentially, when I compared O and Idah, if you looked at the StatsBomb data, you would be picking O, if I'm honest. And if I looked at my own data, it was kind of like profiling two players who've got pretty much the same profiles, the same strengths. It's bizarre, and they're the same age, very similar strengths. I think Idah's more effective. I think Idah's a better player outside the box than O is, and I think actually Idah's better in the air than O is. But in all other respects, O's numbers actually from the not this season but from last season under Ange, O's numbers were better than Idah's this season. Okay, so we talk about being smart, right? That to me, I would be looking at that. But frankly, it doesn't matter what I think because Brendan Rodgers likes Idah and O's not been on the bench for months. And he clearly doesn't like him for whatever reason.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, we saw a trend with Rodgers this season in that when push came to shove, he chose players that he could trust. And I know, like, you're speaking in data terms here, but I mean, if Rodgers feels that he can trust Idah, does that not outweigh the idea that O is a better player? If the manager can't trust the player to perform when needed, then he's not much good to you.
So this is where you hope there's a healthy, constructive conversation, comparing data and analysis with manager hunch and opinion. And listen, Brendan Rodgers is the expert here, clearly, right? It's not just some guy. This guy, Rodgers has managed lots of footballers and knows what he wants out of players. So, that clearly is very important, and data isn't everything. It's just one part of the jigsaw. So all of that for sure. But I'm just a little bit scratching my head up to it, in all honesty, as to why we're in this situation. I'm not saying that would turn out to be the better player than Idah. I'm just saying they profile very similarly. And if I had somebody in the building that could do the same job that Idah was brought in to do, rather than spending 6 million, I'd be getting this guy to
Play the guy you already have.
That's all I'm saying.
Right.
And there might be things going on behind the scenes. There might be, attitude things. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But that's so I'm kind of with James. I honestly think if we're going to spend £6 million on a striker, I think we could do better. I really do. And that's not to, Ida's made an impact, bit of cult status, the 2 Derby goals he's got, the late penalty at Hibs and all that. And I get all that. But just trying to step back and just look at performance, I wouldn't be disappointed if we kind of found a smarter alternative, to be honest.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say is, to me, there were, I go through my whole benchmarking exercise when we sign players, and there haven't been too many cases where I've missed on the over optimistic side, right? So, my reputation precedes me on that, and justifiably so. The two that I was relatively optimistic on that got ghosted this season were O and Holm. And Holm seemed to be kind of a different type of guy, shall we say. So, and to Alan's point, no way of knowing it, training and how guys respond, having to compete for their job and, earn their place onto the bench and or playing time. And some people just don't respond well to that, so I could see that. Again, I'm not saying this is the case, but if guys throw a huff and start to be more about themselves than the team, so I could see those scenarios, playing out. But to your point, Enda, I mean, this is what the stats and the accompanying advanced analysis can help with, is measuring what actually happened. So when you say he doesn't trust O, it wouldn't be because of what he actually has done when he's played. It shouldn't be, I should say, in a big sense, meaning that, again, we're not talking, unless he's like just talent, he's just completely not following instructions and, that kind of stuff. Like we can't know about that. So maybe he's just a TikTok. Oh, I don't know. But yeah, but, so that, we can't rule out those kinds of issues, but generally speaking, to Alan's point, and this goes back to this issue of that I always talk about, and I spend a lot of time trying to figure out, is how much is, Celtic driven and competitive situation of Celtic versus how much is player specific and as far as what their performance contribution is. And that's the part where when I was, I've talked about repeatedly in the last few months about replacement level. Like, to me, Idah is a replacement level Celtic striker. Like, I don't see him as being likely to be a guy that develops into a line leading Champions League or late stage Europa League guy who's going to win us a trophy or get us into the last 16 of the Champions League, that kind of thing. Like, he might be a solid player, could be a solid number 2, but to me, he's probably not a needle mover and like a drop your jaw,
Well,
game changer.
he was brought in to be the backup to Kyogo. He performed as the backup to Kyogo, and he performed it as pretty much as well as the other guy did previously. The end.
Yeah,
I don't think that's worth $6 million. Frankly, I don't.
Yeah, and that was kind of my view when I did my benchmarking of him up to until prior to joining in January. That's basically what I kind of laid out as his upside. I mean, I thought he was probably a good candidate to do exactly what he did, which is to be an impactful sub and, be very good in that role.
Just a final point for me, because like this is not a hill I'm willing to die on. I wouldn't be, desperately upset if Celtic didn't go out and spend the 6 million and they brought in someone else. But can it not be true that O and Idah profile quite similarly, and we have the similar enough players in the building as what Idah does, but Idah is a clutch player and O is not?
That's fair, and but again, I don't know how you'd get a sense of that. I mean, O scored the winning goal against St Mirren, crucial goal this season. With 5 or 6 minutes to go, right?
Who got the assist on that one? The other guy that got ghosted.
You've got better memory than me.
Yeah.
So it comes back. I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's a good question. I just come back to we simply don't have enough data. We haven't seen in those situations, and fair enough. Idah's performed, in big games and big moments, and that absolutely is a factor. And it's not a, it's more of a qualitative thing than a quantitative thing for sure. And I accept that absolutely. But I'm not convinced that O wouldn't have done similar. Really. I just don't know. I don't. I'm not saying
Yeah.
he would. I just don't know.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. I mean, ultimately, it'll come down to Brendan Rodgers, I would imagine, whether or not they bring him back. Another guy involved in the goal, James. I presume you have something to say about Bernardo. I mean, like, I really don't know where I fall on Bernardo. I'm like, at some really, really decent. He was a completely different player to what I thought he was going to be.
Yeah.
Real sort of midfield, and I mean this in the best possible way, like a donkey, not in a, he's bad at football kind of way. More so, he's a water carrier, and that's not what I expected him from at all. But I mean, he's had a couple of big moments. He, got that goal again in the derby, um, the run at the weekend to do this, but also some decent performances in the Champions League as well. Like, solid without lighting the world alight.
Yeah, I would actually say not solid, generally speaking. I mean, he's had aspects of his play that have contributed. But again, we're talking about a Celtic midfield position on a dominant team that it should be a impactful attacking force. I mean, that is the description of what that position should be. That's what we talked about with, and that doesn't necessarily mean scoring goals and even creating assists. We've talked about ball progression. These transition phases, which are so important to get, come from the defensive third to the middle third to the front, the attacking third, and but every time I go back and do a comprehensive review of his performance levels, they're just not up to snuff. I mean, it's just they're just not. Um, and that doesn't mean that it's impossible that he could develop into it. But again, he's not 19. He's not 20 playing at this. He's not like the kid at what's his name, Lennon at or Miller, Lennon Miller at Motherwell, who played at 17 in the Premiership, or Connor Barron, who's I think 19 or 20 at Aberdeen, right? So you got to take development and how old these players are. And 23 is not young anymore. I'm sorry. Like I keep saying this for years now, but 23 is middle aged in modern, dynamic sport. And so, yes, could he get better from here? But his baseline is so poor from a total game perspective. Like if you look at all of his elements of, the one thing he's pretty good at defending. I mean, that he is. And he did a decent job of doing that in the Champions League this year. But that was all he did. Like he did not help with buildup. He didn't help with attack. He didn't help in attacking transitions to a level that we need. So to me, I mean, again, I always fall back to what's the price. Um, but I don't see him being a material upgrade on and to spend money on to bring him in. To me, if he was some guy we brought in on loan from, a second division Spanish team or French team, I think the Benfica label and the recency bias with Jota is really clouding, along with the two uh, issues of Derby dust. And they were one was a great finish and one was a great turn, and a pretty good shot from distance. Um, but that's for the most part he hasn't done much else in
Yeah,
attack, and so yeah,
yeah.
I'm a hard no, unless they get him for such a number that if you have the upside of maybe he does develop. Um, but again, even there, I'm not terribly optimistic because he's not that young.
Yeah, I think that's probably a more detailed version of what I meant by water carrier, in that, like, you
Yeah,
know, he doesn't really have the passing ability. He doesn't have the flair of Hatate. He doesn't have the control of Cal McGregor. Like, if you're looking at what does he bring to the team? You can
And he's
see
not even
why
that
he.
fast. He's not
Yeah,
even
no,
that fast.
he's quite slow. Positionally quite good. Apart from
Right.
that, I think he disappointed. I think, like you're saying about Benfica, is that because he came from Benfica and because he had already made senior appearances for the club, you were almost expecting this sort of dynamic, fast paced
You expect
Portuguese
him to
player,
be
and
one of the best players in the league.
yeah, and that's not what he was. I think Celtic have an option to buy for 6 million, Alan. So I don't think I think this is a bit more clear cut. I think Celtic can do better for 6 million than Paulo Bernardo.
Yeah, I mean, other than his age, he's actually 22. I don't disagree with much of that, really. So, um, yeah, he's actually sort of saying, whilst we're in the mood to annoy people, this will annoy people, but it's a fact. He's actually got a higher expected assists value than Hatate, right? But his expected goals is significantly lower than Hatate, surprisingly. So overall, but you see, again, I would use Matt O'Reilly as a benchmark here for what we need out of a number eight.
I was going to say, Alan, that's an indictment on the complete abstraction of where people think Hatate is versus the reality of where he is.
Can I
as
ask a
opposed
question?
To,
and his last six performances have been almost off the cliff, right?
Yeah. On the expected assist, though, how many were assists? Like, where's his
actual
threshold?
assist rate? Sorry, bear with me. I'm looking at incredibly detailed and complicated spread. I say complicated. They've just got lots of numbers on them. So what I mean.
Yeah.
And I apologize for interrupting.
No. His actual assist rate is 0.37 assists per 90 minutes. His expected assists is 0.26. So he's overachieving there. Whereas Hatate's total assist was 0.42, and as expected is 0.24. So again, he overperformed relative to the quality of the chances he actually created. So he got a bit lucky with some of the finishing, maybe, or whatever it might be. But back to Bernardo then. Yeah, I think we've got a real problem, especially if O'Reilly gets sold, because I'm not sure. I'm not convinced by any of the remaining players in that respect. And again, think about Jota, back to Jota. He was Portuguese, similar pedigree, similar kind of background. Came in, and it was just like it was the classic no-brainer, as the kids say. Bernardo's ended up playing the equivalent. Although he's appeared in 33 matches, he's only racked up the equivalent of just over 16 matches worth of minutes. So he's been a bit part player. Again, I come back to, if Celtic are going to pay 6 million, for essentially your fourth choice number 8 or your third choice number 8, I'm thinking you can do. I would be looking to develop home, in all honesty, having invested the money in, or Lowell, or somebody like that, rather than spending 6 million on Bernardo. So he's not creative enough. He didn't give any of that attacking flair that I was expecting, given he seemed to have a pretty good record at Portuguese national level, age level. It's his pack passing. It was where it really all fell down for me. I mean, he probably completes. If you look at Hatate, Hatate's nearly 8 pack passes a game. O'Reilly is just over about 6.5. Even McGregor's nearly 9. Iwata 8.7, and Bernardo was 3.5. 3.47 pack passes. That's just not enough. He's just not. Creative enough in his forward passing. That to me was the one glaring aspect of his play. I did like the fact that in the Europe Champions League games, he gave the team that sort of athleticism and solidity in midfield that we were asking for, and I thought that was really encouraging. But it didn't come with any great threat, you know what I mean, in the final third at that level. So I think it's a no. Excuse me. It's a no from me as well, because again, I come back to, there's no way that he is anywhere near replacing Matt O'Reilly's performances. I mean, just not even in the same universe, right? So, and to me, if I was going to spend 6 million, I'd want to buy a player that I thought might be able to get to that sort of O'Reilly level, in all honesty.
Yeah.
And this isn't that.
Yeah. So then, as we move on to future, and I mean probably immediate future. Brendan Rodgers was speaking on Sky Sports, and I thought he had a pretty interesting quote. He said when he was talking about the squad and transfer plans, he said, "I think there will be a natural change. Some of the players have been here for 3 years, and if you look at the cycle at Celtic, then there is normally the change in that third year. So it's getting to another step in the types of profiles that I would like, I would want within the squad to allow us to progress and to develop." So that to me screams clear out. And we've spoken already. Celtic need a clear out because their squad's too big, but that
It's
to
too big.
me screams clear out of some names that came in under Ange,
Big name
which
players.
yeah, big name players. So like probably accepting that Matt O'Reilly's gone. Probably accepting that anyway. Joe Hart is gone. That's another big change. Tate does not look like a guy who either wants to be or is going to be at the club um, in the next year. Uh, who knows about Kyogo? He just signed a new deal, so that could have been happy days secure him. I think that would be huge for Celtic. But then, as you look through the squad, I mean, just looking at the midfield alone, Iwata failed to impress. Home failed to impress. Kwon is not getting his move to Bayern Munich anytime soon. Um, Matt O'Reilly will be gone. Bernardo will probably be gone. That's 5 players already, just in the midfield alone. Unlikely that Yang will ever make it. Um, like you're talking, you could name about 6, 7, maybe 8 players that you can like immediately say probably will
Keep
not be
going
at the
up.
squad next
Keep
year.
keep
Like
going up.
that's
Well,
a big clear out.
I,
Celtic have a lot of money in the bank here. We do actually this time have a lot of money in the bank and a lot of security financially. Like this is the year that you need to do it. If you're going to do it, you need to start breaking that threshold of what you're spending. And the speculation around, or at least what we speculated around the Kyogo deal and the new contracts that were handed out this season was a raising of that bar of wages. That's where Celtic need to get to bring in those higher level transfers. So, I mean, positivity would say that's what we're aiming towards, but how do we feel heading in? There's also change within the actual transfer element at the club with the recruitment side of things. So, like this is a huge summer for Celtic.
well, I think that the reality is that Rodgers inherited another manager's team that was hugely overrated in my view. And I said it before, so and subsequent to that, and they do not fit the profile that the current manager likes or wants. Pace and power is not, other than maybe Alistair Johnston. You could maybe throw him in that bucket of the pace and power mix. But outside of that, you're really not. There's not much else there. Maeda obviously, but you're to me the 800-pound gorilla is the midfield, and if we're going to compete at the aspired for level with another year aged Callum McGregor playing almost every game, um, we've got to surround him with top athletes, like guys who can run all day at speed with size that are competent, technically. Um, because otherwise, that's at that level. I mean, I went back and looked. I mean, if you basically take from the beginning of the Ange era forward, and I was doing it as kind of a debrief of a lot of things, but we played 20 group games and the tie with Bodo Glimt, and we conceded 2.5 goals on average per game between the two Champions League campaigns and the Europa League in Ange's first season. Um, and I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into this, but one of the big ones has been, I think we just do not have the athleticism in midfield to play at that level. And if you look at even when Rangers had their run in the Europa League to the final, the core of their midfield was two guys that are flawed players, but they're pretty big, strong, and fast. And so to me, that's, with that power and pace, this is where guys like, I even question whether whether Rodgers would want to keep Kyogo as a number one striker, as the lockdown top guy, based off of what his preferences are, based off of who we targeted in his first, tenure. I mean, he's not a dumb guy. Like he used Jamie Vardy very effectively, but he inherited a Jamie Vardy. He didn't sign Jamie Vardy. And Jamie Vardy's got a lot of talent and ability, just like Kyogo. But he's probably got as best of a chance to form, the club in his image and the squad in his image as he's ever going to have at any club.
True.
So I think we might be surprised as how overwhelming the overhaul is this summer. Now, it doesn't mean there's not a lot of risk with that, because there is. And to my knowledge, we haven't, at least that I've seen anyway, hired a new head of recruitment or anything like that. So, we're kind of back to where we were when Ange arrived. It's like, okay, we've got probably a need to do a huge overhaul. And do we have the people and the infrastructure in place to facilitate that and do it in a wise way? So it looks like Rodgers is going to get his crack at it.
Yeah.
With his personal Rolodex. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, Hamish did his usual squad depth graphic, which is very helpful for the likes of this because it saves everyone else doing the research for it. But I mean, like, just looking at the actual graphic that he's created, two glaring areas that Celtic need to improve is definitely at fullback, because Greg Taylor and Adam Montgomery and Alistair Johnson and Anthony Ralston are currently the only fullbacks at the squad. So they're, there's a need for depth there, be that a third choice or Greg Taylor becoming that second choice and a first choice coming in at left back. You've got Cameron Carter-Vickers, Liam Scales, Navrosky, Lagerbielke, Stephen Wells, and Yuki Kobayashi at the club at centre back. I mean, this year it was essentially Cameron Carter-Vickers and Liam Scales, and Navrosky and Lagerbielke weren't trusted at all. So, I mean, do you need more there in the midfield? As I mentioned already, Cal McGregor is aging. Matt O'Reilly is probably gone. Hatate, we don't know. Awata isn't good enough to be anything other than a replacement. You do have Daniel Kelly coming back from loan. You do have Home, who, I think showed decent enough sparks. And you've got Quan. I mean, Quan's never going to be a Celtic player, to be honest. But you do also have Boston Lawwell coming back on loan from Fleetwood Town, who did quite well this year. I think he could fit the bill for the power and pace and strength that Rodgers is looking for. Whether he can kick on now and be a Celtic player is another question. Right wing, you've got Kuhn, Yang, Forrest, and Tilio. Tilio didn't exist this year. Yang wasn't good enough this year. Forrest was clutch when he needed to be, and then Kuhn was decent. And then left wing, you've got Palma, who disappeared mid-season. Maeda, Rokovada, who is still, could be gone at the end of, you never know. He could be a player that leaves the club. Mikey Johnson coming back from West Brom, not deemed good enough for Brendan Rodgers this year. And Sead Haksabanovic. And then you've got Kyogo and O in the middle. So, I mean, that's not a good squad. That's not a good squad. There's a lot of work to do there, Alan.
So it's quite stunning, actually. And the parallels with Postecoglou's first season are quite stark as well, in that essentially Rodgers settled on 17 players that he could use. There's only 17 players this season have got 900 minutes plus, and of those 17, if you remove the ones that probably don't appear to be in Rodgers' long-term plans, and then the likes of Joe Hart, and if we assume that Matt O'Reilly is going to get sold, that 17 becomes 12, right? And if you look at those 12, I personally, this is just my opinion, I would argue that of those 12, only McGregor, Johnston, Carter-Vickers, Maeda, and Kyogo would, to me, be players I'd be happy to see playing every week in the first team. That's incredible, right? This is a huge job. This is an absolutely huge job. There's 23 players that we used this season that didn't manage to complete 900 minutes. But if you look at those, a number have already left the club. 2 or 3 more were on loan. And so of those, who realistically that was kind of bit part do you see stepping up and being one of those first team starters? Nawrocki? I don't know. Home? Didn't seem likely at this stage from with the information that we have today. How many of the youth prospects, the likes of Daniel Kelly that you mentioned, Vata, Tilio, Mitchell Frame, Bosun Lowell, Montgomery, Ben Summers, Matt Anderson, who's had a really good season in Austria, second division. Toby Oluwayemi, sorry, the goalkeeper who also played in Austria. I mean, of those players, Lawal and Anderson had terrific loan spells. I would like to think they would at least be given a shot over pre-season to take a squad place. But again, we're scratching at the surface here in terms of, I've just gone through my squad list. I reckon there's probably 14 first team, forget the youth players, 14 first team players that Celtic need to get rid of, right? This is an enormous job that is ahead of us here. And we know from the past that these things don't happen in one window. It's just not feasible. I mean, it's just logistics, right? There's only one guy signing checks, right? There's a limited number of people in the recruitment department. There's only one Brendan Rodgers, as the song goes. So, this isn't. We don't have an army of 100 people, doing this stuff, right? There's only so many contract negotiations you can be in at any one time. This is a huge job. This is a massive, massive job that we have ahead of us. And if the answer is that Rodgers has been given the keys and everyone else has to kind of kowtow to his demands, that as Liverpool found out, that could be horrendous. Really, I hope everyone's kind of grown up a bit since those days, and that it is more of a kind of team effort, and that we have talent in the recruitment team and so forth. That means that they and the manager work together. That I think that is to be seen, and we also need talent in the business management side of it to get rid of those players. I mean, we need to get rid of those players. We can't have a squad of 40, 50 players. It's just, it's not feasible. We'll start to fall foul of FSR. It's not next season, but the season after. We're down to 70% of football income has to be, no more than 70% can be spent on player wages. Now, that you might think, oh, we're in the Champions League. Yeah, we're in the Champions League, but will we be in the Champions League next season, the season after? And you can't budget for that, right? You can't. That would be madness if you did. So you have to budget at a level that assumes you only get into the Champions League maybe one every so many years. That's a risk decision that you have to make, a risk management decision call that you have to make, because you're gonna have to. You can't hit 70% one year and then not hit it the next year because you didn't get into the Champions League, right? So you have to be sustainability means having a wage bill that's sustainable in the good years and sustainable in the bad years and the next bad year. Right, so we have to get rid of a load of players that are probably on good wages. This is a huge, huge job that we have here.
Yeah, I do realize we're almost an hour into the podcast, so we don't want to labor it too much. But I mean, I thought the most interesting part of that Brendan Rodgers interview was what he mentioned in the quote that I read out was the 3-year element to the cycle. And like I've been thinking about the way that Celtics run as a club and how it's set up, and sporting directors and all that there, manager versus everything. And like a part of me is coming around to the 3-year cycle. A part of me is thinking that Celtics should not be planning longer term beyond a 3-year cycle, because the 3-year cycle is likely how long we can hold on to players like Matt O'Reilly and the really top players that we do manage to get into the club at a low budget. It's generally the length, or at least half the length of the tenure that the managers that we've had undergo. And it's generally the length of time where Celtic can feasibly plan ahead to the point of they know what their financial situation is going to be. So like a part of me is like, maybe we just aim for 3-year cycles like this. Maybe we just aim to bring in as much quality as we can within 3 years, develop them, sell them, and then you have a massive clear out again. Hopefully not to the extent that we have to keep doing it, but you start to narrow that framework that, okay, we're getting rid of 14 players this year. Next year, a realistic thing would be we only need to get rid of 10. And then you start to lower that gap and you just aim for 3 years rather than thinking 10 years down the line, this is where Celtic need to be. I don't know if that's completely wacko or not.
I think it's not wacko. I think the issue becomes the degree, right? So there's going to be natural talent cycles even within the 3-year cycles that you're talking about. You have ebbs and flows based off of development, your hit rate, and recruitment. Even if you're doing it well, even within the band, Brighton's going to have their own swings as far as the quality that they bring in. Even though they're doing a good job generally, there's always some swings there. So I think the issue is raising the level of all of those things, and that's the constant challenge. And the incoherence of the manager of God as God model is that you almost by definition turn it into a major overhaul every 3 years or 2 years. And that and some of that's just human. I mean, you have look at what's his name, De Zerbi, the guy that just left Brighton, right? These managers have big egos. This is a guy who knows better than how Brighton's running things. That's why he left, apparently. Or at least that's my read and take on it. I don't know, fair enough. Everyone's not, but it's like, dude, look at why Brighton's doing well. It wasn't you. No offense. Ask Potter about that. And how's he going to do depending on where he goes next? So getting all these structural things in place raises that floor, and I think that's we're basically now into year 4, going into year 4 as far as wasted time. Meaning that looking at that squad that you just went through, those depth, that is a byproduct of 4 seasons of incoherence. And of that, you could even start a little earlier than that, because of the incoherence of the recruitment. There was talent there, but it wasn't necessarily coherently recruited relative to Lennon's last couple of seasons. So it is right. I've written about and I talked about a lot. I mean, look at the talent that was in that 1920 season. The Frimpongs, the guys that were even role players that were pretty good, like real high level talent guys. El Yunusi's gone on to have really productive seasons in Midtjylland, and even Eric Sviatchenko coming out. Like our talent levels, they've gone on to have good seasons at other clubs. So we're not getting enough talent through the door. So this is the definition of madness, the insanity. I would just keep doing this over and over again, hoping that we're just going to magically start bringing in talent and value for money. And maybe it'll happen this time. Like Roger's a smart guy. He's got a Rolodex. He knows a lot of people, I'm presuming, in the industry. So, he'll have relatively low hanging fruit, like Ange did. I mean, the first window and a half for Ange was really good. So hopefully we get the benefit of that this window and next with Rodgers. But again, is it sustainable? Is it going to take us to that level of that we constantly talk about? I'm still skeptical until we see evidence that it's shifting.
Well, that's actually why I think we should bring our approach back. Like, so if you look at, say, the last, how many years is it? 7 years. There's been good players come and go from the club based on that amount of time, and the amount of quality that we brought in to the club has degenerated throughout those 7 years. But if we concentrate on just 3 years on a 3-year cycle and get the talent levels back up in those 3 years, we can forget about what happens in the 6-year period. So, like, you named a couple of players there. You could name, in the past 6 years, Celtic have had Frimpong, who just won, the Bundesliga with Bayer Leverkusen, probably going to go to a bigger club again. Christopher Ayer has finally broke through at Brentford and is playing Premier League football. Odsonne Edouard is playing for Crystal Palace. Cal McGregor would be playing for a big club in the Premier League had he left. Ryan Christie is playing Premier League football for Bournemouth this season. Um, you had Dembele, who went on to play for Lyon, played for Atletico Madrid. His career slightly tailed off, and you name some of the bit part players as well. On top of that, plus say Matt O'Reilly, for example. So you've got a good talent base there, but the problem is in that team that Rodgers had, that had Ayer, that had Edouard, that had Dembele, they had 5 or 6 really top level players. Whereas now you could look at Celtic and they only have 3. So the aim is to always have 6 to 7 top quality players. I think that's a realistic thing that Celtic should be aiming for, Alan.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it is harder. It's becomes every year it becomes increasingly difficult to attract good players to Scotland. That's going to continue to be an issue. The quality of the league isn't improving. That's self-evident by performances in Europe, and so that it just becomes a harder sell. It's a complicated picture. One of the one of the many Brexit dividends, one has to say, is that other markets for footballers have opened up. It is now possible to sign Brazilian players and so forth a lot easier than it was when you had kind of EU residency rules and all that sort of thing. So it's a complicated picture, but and Celtic, this is the last year that we've got guaranteed Champions League football, and so again,
that actually looks ominous from everything that I'm saying. I mean, we're very unlikely to be in Champions League, 3 to 4 years out.
Yeah, we need those coefficient monkeys to get busy and start winning some games in those minor competitions. Come on, coefficient monkeys, get busy. That's what I say. Yeah, but yeah, no, seriously, that's a real concern. That we don't recover, that coefficient place. Now these things, they ebb and flow a little bit. I think the Chechia's had a good year, etc. But once you slip out, it's hard to then come back in. So all of that, yeah, is hard. It's harder. But like you say, the biggest concern I have is just still that I've got no confidence that we've got a fully functioning recruitment capability. And I don't just mean data. I mean actually, I mean more the personnel. Do we have the best people? The talent in the right roles, because that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to the talent of the people doing the recruiting. Celtic should be able to find players on their price point that mean that we can put out a competitive team in the Champions League. And by competitive, I mean a shot at winning 3 or 4 matches maybe in the new format. Right, we should be able to do that with the wage bill that we pay. I think ours is not that much lower than Atalanta's that got to the Europa League final, and they won the Europa League. Sorry, and they, they're a much smaller club really in all other respects, other than obviously the TV money they get from Italy. So that's the sort of benchmarking that they need to do. We've talked about this for years now, and I've still got no confidence though that is going to happen, and that will be the case. And if it is all down to Rodgers, again, I come back to he's a very good coach. I'm not sure he's an elite recruiter of talent, right? So, and that's a different skill set. It needs different talent in those roles.
And what we found out is Anne sure as hell isn't.
No.
Right. I mean, he had a pretty decent hit rate in that first window. Second window, okay.
Yeah, he had his manager was one of these global super agents, so he had him on speed dial, and he had as James calls it, the low hanging fruit, the ones that he just knew from Japan mainly, or from that part of the world. So yeah, and Rodgers' expertise is in England, and we know that is a very risky and expensive market to be taking punts on players.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we can go round and round in circles with the conversation that we've practically been having since we started this podcast, and it's just that there are obvious disadvantages that Celtic have to fight against. Not mainly the financial standpoint of global football right now, but also, like you mentioned, Atalanta there. It's all well and good that Atalanta have a similar wage bill than Celtic, but Atalanta play in the Serie A, and playing in Italy is a much more promising prospect for a player than playing in the Scottish League. It's much more attractive for them to say, if they play well at Atalanta, that might get them a move to AC Milan. You're not getting a move to AC Milan from Celtic. You might get a move to Bournemouth. It's these things do play a role, but the fundamental issue is that Celtic don't have the personnel at the club that have a good success rate when it comes to bringing in good quality players, and they don't have people in the board that have a good success rate in spending any sort of real money when it really matters. And I think John McGinn is always the one that stands out as, you had him, he wanted to come to the club, he was ready to go, and then they just didn't want to spend that tiny bit extra that it takes to develop the club. So are we optimistic is probably where I would finish the podcast.
I'm actually reasonably optimistic for next season because I do think we'll get some low hanging fruit. Like I think that the floor is pretty elevated. There are risks around that because again, the other problem with all this is the longer that we dick around, just by luck, Rangers could back into someone who's actually talented at their job. Right. So they got this new guy in from PSV. I was actually reasonably impressed with what they did in January. I have no idea on what they've signed so far, but and then they're like perpetually a basket case in many regards. But we keep giving them an opportunity to just go from being a big basket case to reasonably not a basket case, and just with normal variance, all of a sudden the league's a 2-team league. You're like it was this season. I mean, we basically gifted them a chance to make this a title race into April, because of bad recruitment and injuries and a lot of other things. So I just I'm relatively optimistic for next season. Changing the Champions League format should help in that regard. Um, but to Alan's point, I mean, it's hard to overstate the degree with which this could be an overhaul, and quite frankly, should be, given the talent levels that we have. But again, you talk to the 3-year cycle, and does Maeda want to be here forever? I mean, is Glasgow the place he wants to be long term? He's been here a number of seasons already, and given his profile as a player, he could I'm sure, go play in the Bundesliga on a high press team, which there's no shortage of teams in in Germany that could use his services, and he could probably double his wages, that kind of thing. So, I, I, I'm optimistic in the scope of the opportunity. And I'm going to stick with that optimism for now. The problem is I was this optimistic last summer at this time. And then the summer window went completely off the rails, and that turned, up until the last day of the window, I was holding out hope of optimism that we'd sign somebody like Kvistgarden or somebody like that. So I am resolute in maintaining optimism for now. What about you, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, all the building blocks are there. If you hold to the view that Rogers has effectively won an internal mini war for control, then which I don't think is far from reality. And I would, as I've observed many times as the season's going to come to an end, the cohesion that I sense, especially amongst the player and the player and the managers, and Brendan himself, seems to be, I suppose somebody put it to me, got his mojo back. When I use a non-data term, but he just seems more relaxed, but also driven a little bit in his work. That all points to me that there isn't this cultural baggage in the building that is kind of has this very sort of Celtic way of doing business, and that we have the opportunity here. We certainly have the resources, right? We have the resources. We have an opponent who, to James's point, they only have to beat Hearts, right, to make it a two horse race, right? So that's why, as impoverished as they undoubtedly are, and as bad as their recruitment has been, so long as it's good enough to beat Hearts, you've got the kernel of a title race. And if Clermont, if they have, like say, a more talented manager that can figure out how to beat Celtic, then it can be game on, even with a massive disparity in resources. But Celtic shouldn't fall into the trap of looking at that and making decisions based on that. They should benchmark themselves in Europe, and they should take care and build a squad that they feel can win. As I say, 3 out of 8 at least Champions League matches next season. At least get through to the next stage. And if you do that, the Scottish League will take care of itself. Trust me, it will just take care of itself because we're far better resourced and will be for years to come, unless something unforeseen happens. We will be the better resourced team for many, 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 many years to come. But and the tensions and the difficulties in the building appear to now have gone away. Are these people talented enough now to do this job well? This is the next step, and we've got to hope that will be the case. But it's to be proven, I would say. So let's be optimistic and say that it will be proven, but it's to be proven.
Yeah, I mean, God knows how many times I've said on this channel before, and that if Celtic aim for Europe, then that will always be naturally good enough to win the Scottish League. Celtic should not be winning to aim or aiming to win the Scottish League. They should be aiming to make a dent in Europe, because that's the league will take care of itself at that point. If you're good enough in Europe, you'll be good enough to win the Scottish League. That's a simple principle that Celtic haven't followed over the last decade and a half, really, and that's why we've seen that regression in the club, because they've been happy to take their 9 in a row, happy to take the trebles, happy to take the trophies, which is all well and good. But then if it's great, it's great as fans. I'm not going to say it's not, but
yeah. So you're touching on a pet peeve of mine. I don't think they were happy with that. I think that they have not properly analyzed and judged how that translates into Europe. I mean, I think they overestimate, and I think there is some risk to that with this season. If you project forward certain things with certain players, and you assume because we've lorded over Scottish football for all these years now, I think there's been a bad job at understanding what that means and how it manifests in Europe or doesn't. And that's, I still think we're still there, by the way. And there's a lot of nuances to how this season played out that may cover in the future, but that aren't projectable, I think.
Yeah.
And this is where you get into like fan narratives, things like signing Bernardo and Enda. Like, understandably, fans get caught up in narratives and personalities, and this has always been my concern and criticism, is that a lot of times in the boardroom, it seemed like, or the CEO level, prior CEO, that it was almost being run like a fan, as opposed to more of a ruthless, objective, sporting enterprise that are both paranoid and mercilessly ambitious in moving things forward. And so I think I think Rodgers knows all of this. And if you looked at, I mean, given the state of the squad and what we did in Europe this year, and I would argue we were more competitive with a much worse squad, given the injury situation and the terrible recruitment. That's partly why, like I said, I have that optimism going forward. I mean, we just have to get some recruitment right, and I think Rodgers will turn that into a competitive force, given the new Champions League format. But again, Atalanta just won the Europa League. Rangers made a Europa League final. Was it Olympiacos just won the Conference League?
Yeah.
Right? You get into the Dortmund's in the freaking Champions League final tomorrow. I mean, they are not that good of a team. So you get into these tournaments and you just need your shot. You need to, and that speaks to the fact that we've been in these tournaments every year, and we haven't even taken even a pretend shot. Like, it's been almost ridiculous how bad we've been. You almost have to try to be this bad. So yeah, something has to change.
Yeah. Well, what I was saying there, I wasn't doing the, the conspiracy idea that the Celtic board have conspired to keep
Oh
themselves close
no,
to Rangers to
yeah,
keep
no,
that alive. That's not what I'm saying. But what if you read the retirement statement from Peter Lawwell, who left the club for about 2 seconds? Um, it had a list of all his glowing achievements, which are notable and are fair to list as achievements as a CEO. But he seemed pretty pleased with himself that he was leaving the club in a better position than when he got it, even though in a global sense they weren't. Like, so, I mean, that's more what I meant by that. But I
Eh,
should say I am more optimistic going into the summer than
well,
I was last year.
my typically long-winded effort, I could just said, I think they're true believers. I think Peter Law actually believes that. I don't think it's this big upping. Like I think that they actually value what they've done domestically and almost ignore Europe. It's almost like a compartmentalized. Oh, they don't want to think about it.
But it's
It's because
simple. It's
it's not.
simple. It's simple
Yeah,
in their mind. In their mind, it's simple. Two things. One is look at the trophies that Celtic won
right.
domestically, and every year Desmond got his dividend, and that's it. That is literally it. That is it. And our point is, okay, they're legitimate goals, right, for a business, but you're missing the European. You're completely ignored the key performance benchmark that you need to use to actually judge yourself. And on that basis, we've failed miserably, absolutely miserably, for years, as you said.
Yeah.
And that's that thinking that needs to change.
Well, hopefully we do start to see a bit of change over the summer at Celtic. Before we finish up the podcast, I should say there is going to be a bit of change on this podcast. Um, this is going to be my last Huddle Breakdown recording. Um, Several reasons. There's loads that goes into it, but essentially, as you may have noticed, the consistency levels have been below par this season in terms of the podcast. It's 95% my fault. I went back to the office this year with a new job. Became increasingly more difficult to record the podcast at a time that suited all three of us. And I'm also moving to Australia in July. So, a further change to scheduling is not something that's going to help or benefit the podcast. So, for the
Sorry,
benefit
Enda.
of the.
Sorry, Enda, to
Yeah.
interrupt. Make sure you've got your ticket for the right plane.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, it's
Too
easy when
soon. Too
it's
soon.
easy when Scales' agent uses his private plane
Yeah.
to send Enda to the. I hear rumors of a oceanfront Gold Coast flat that's being rented in your name based off of what's been going on here the last couple of years and this new
Do you
bumper
know that
contract.
little 4-year contract? Nice little bonus for that. That's what I'm saying.
It's good work if you can
But
get
yeah,
it, I'll tell you.
yeah, I'll tell you. Yeah, it's been a blast. It's been a pleasure. It's been miserable at times. I will say that it has. Firstly, for a couple of reasons. For sometimes trying to think of what to talk about when Ange was just winning 5-0 every week. To the first season of the podcast where we had to sit through COVID ball and Neil Lennon, and that's where it all started. It all started in a bedroom where I was recording off my phone, and chance message to James led to this podcast. So, yeah, an absolute mad couple of years, and massive thank you to the two men that are on the podcast with me for putting up with me and putting in way more work than I did over the course of the 4 years, watching the games more closely, providing the stats, providing the entertainment, providing the chat. And a massive thank you to everybody who watched and subscribed and listened and commented and hated us and loved us. And we got like some unbelievably kind messages over the last 4 years. Some horrible messages too, which is part of it. We'll take that, but the good ones are always the ones you remember more. So thank you to everyone who did listen and did subscribe and did comment and everything. All that.
So
That's the sappy stuff out of the way.
so yeah, sad for sure. And Enda is the rock really that holds all this together. Us two idiots wouldn't have
the,
much of a
the
clue
actual
otherwise.
the actual professional
Yeah,
Alan.
yeah. So listen, but so very sad. But it should make clear as well that James and I will kind of muddle on. I guess.
We'll see. If one of us idiots can figure out the tech side.
We'll try. We'll try anyway. But yeah, it
we'll
won't.
see.
It won't be the same. It won't be the same for sure.
As long as you get your internet sorted, Alan, it'll be grand.
All right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Righto. For the last time from me, thanks very much. And James and Alan will talk to you next time on the channel. Hopefully, it'll all come together and it'll look as professional and as normal as always. Until then, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, and we'll chat to you later.